For 23 years, poured coffee and filed papers. Invisible, forgotten, just part of the furniture. But when Margaret Rose finally stood to speak, the most powerful men in the state fell silent because they had no idea who they were really dealing with. The coffee was always perfect, never too hot, never too weak. Always ready at exactly 7:47 a.m. when Harrison Blackwood stepped off the private elevator into the executive suite of Blackwood Industries. For 23 years, Margaret Rose had been invisible in plain sight, moving through the marble hallways like morning mist, present but unnoticed, essential but unacknowledged. Her desk sat outside Blackwood's corner office, a fortress of mahogany and privilege that commanded a view of 3 counties. From there, she watched the empire run on decisions that would reshape the Appalachian landscape forever. She typed memos that moved mountains literally, filed contracts that raised forests, scheduled meetings that decided the fate of entire towns, and no one saw her. Not really. Harrison saw a middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun, conservative dresses, sensible shoes, a woman who kept her head down and her mouth shut. The perfect secretary, efficient, loyal, invisible. What he didn't see was the fire. What he couldn't know was the past. And what he never suspected was that every memo she typed, every contract she filed, every meeting she scheduled was being quietly, carefully, methodically documented in a safe deposit box 3 towns over. Because Margaret Rose wasn't just a secretary, she was a daughter of Millfield Hollow, and Millfield Hollow was about to be erased from the map. The morning everything changed started like any other. Harrison's Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floors as he strode past her desk, barely glancing in her direction. He was already talking into his phone something about environmental impact studies and managing public perception. Margaret's fingers paused over the keyboard. Environmental impact studies. For the Millfield project, her home she'd grown up in. A white clapboard house on Sycamore Street, where her grandmother taught her to can peaches and her grandfather showed her which mushrooms were safe to pick after summer rains. Where she'd learned to read by tracing her finger along her mother's worn Bible. Where she'd buried her parents in the small cemetery overlooking Miller's Creek. The same creek that Blackwood Industries planned to poison with copper runoff. The same cemetery they planned to relocate. The same community of 800 souls they planned to scatter to the wind for a mining operation that would strip the mountains bare and leave behind a moonscape of profit and devastation. Margaret had kept silent for 3 years, watching the plans develop from whispered conversations to detailed blueprints to signed contracts. She'd typed the correspondence with state officials. She'd scheduled the meetings with environmental regulators. She'd filed the briefs that outlined exactly how they planned to circumvent federal protection. Laws. All of it legal. All of it monstrous. And all of it documented. Because Margaret Rose hadn't just been filing papers. She'd been building a case. At 11:30 a.m., Harrison buzzed her intercom. "Margaret, I need you to prepare the Millfield contracts for the governor's office. Full environmental package. And make sure the community impact assessment emphasizes job creation, not displacement. Community impact assessment. Such clean language. For such dirty work." Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the files. Inside the manila folder were documents that would legally authorize the destruction of everything she'd ever loved. Maps that showed her childhood home marked with a red X, projections that listed her neighbors as acceptable losses in exchange for economic development. She opened the folder, read the cover page. And for the first time in 23 years of invisible service, Margaret Rose made a decision that would change everything. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but never called. "Channel 9 News, this is Sarah." Margaret's voice was steady, calm, deadly quiet. "I have a story for you. About Blackwood Industries, about Millfield Hollow, about what they're planning to do, and about what they don't want you to know. A pause. Who is this? Margaret looked at the executive suite around her. The marble, the mahogany. The view of 3 counties spread out like a kingdom below. Someone who's been invisible too long. That afternoon, Margaret did something she'd never done in 2 decades of employment. She left early. Not because she was sick, not because of an emergency, because she had an appointment at a law office in Charleston with an environmental attorney named David Chun, who specialized in cases that seemed impossible to win, cases where ordinary people faced off against corporate giants, cases where truth mattered more than money. David Chun looked exactly like what Margaret had expected: young, intense, slightly rumpled, with the kind of passion that burned bright enough to light up a courtroom. His office was cluttered with legal briefs and coffee cups, photographs of strip-mined mountains and poisoned rivers, covering every available wall space. He listened without interrupting as Margaret spread 23 years of documentation across his conference table. Memos, emails, phone records, financial projections, environmental studies that had been buried, safety reports that had been altered, correspondence with state officials that revealed exactly how environmental protections were being purchased and sold like commodities. When she finished, David sat back in his chair, staring at the mountain of evidence. How long have you been collecting this? Since the first day I heard about Millfield. Why now? Why come forward now? Margaret looked out his window at the city sprawling below. Somewhere beyond those buildings, beyond the highways and the shopping centers, lay the mountains where she'd been born, where her parents were buried, where 800 people were about to lose everything they'd ever known. Because someone has to speak for the ones who can't speak for themselves. David nodded slowly. This could destroy you, you know. Blackwood has resources, lawyers, political connections. They'll come after you with everything they have. Margaret smiled then, for the first time in years. Mr. Chun, they've been trying to destroy my home for 3 years. They just didn't know I was watching. That night, Margaret sat in her small apartment overlooking the Kanawha River, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold in her hands. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the mask would come off. For 23 years, she'd been exactly what Harrison Blackwood wanted her to be. Invisible, forgettable, safe. Margaret Rose hadn't been born to be safe. She'd been born to be a guardian. And guardians, when their time comes, don't ask for permission. They stand up, they speak truth, and they protect what matters, no matter the cost. Outside her window, the lights of Charleston glittered like stars. But Margaret wasn't looking at the city. She was looking beyond it, toward the mountains where morning would break over Millfield Hollow one more time. Where people who trusted her, people who didn't even know her name, were sleeping peacefully in homes that were marked for destruction. Where a battle was about to begin that would determine whether justice could still prevail when money and power seemed to hold all the cards. Margaret finished her tea, washed the cup and placed it carefully in the dish drainer. Tomorrow, the war began, but tonight she was still invisible. And invisibility, as she was about to prove, could be the most powerful weapon of all. The morning Margaret Rose declared war on Blackwood Industries dawned crisp and clear over Charleston, West Virginia. She arrived at the office at her usual time, 7:30 a.m., 30 minutes before anyone else, and performed her morning ritual exactly as she had for 23 years. Coffee brewing, newspapers arranged, phone messages sorted, calendar updated. The only difference was the letter, sealed in a white envelope, addressed to Harrison Blackwood, sitting precisely in the center of his desk blotter where he would see it the moment he walked in. Her resignation, effective immediately. Margaret had debated the timing. Part of her wanted to disappear quietly, to simply not show up one morning and let them figure it out. But that wasn't who she was. Even in revolution, she believed in courtesy. At 7:47 a.m., Harrison's elevator chimed. Margaret looked up from her computer screen, watching him stride across the marble expanse with his usual confidence. Armani suit, Italian shoes, the bearing of a man who had never doubted his right to reshape the world according to his vision. He nodded curtly in her direction, his standard greeting, and disappeared into his office. 30 seconds later, she heard him shout, "Margaret!" She had expected anger. What she heard was something else entirely. Confusion, fear. The voice of a man who had just realized that the ground beneath his feet might not be as solid as he believed. She gathered her purse, her personal coffee mug, and the small framed photograph of her parents that had sat on her desk for 2 decades. Then she walked into his office for the last time. Harrison stood behind his massive desk, the letter crumpled in his fist, his face flushed red with fury. What the hell is this supposed to mean? Margaret looked at him with a calm expression. She'd perfected over 2 decades of absorbing his temper tantrums. "I think it's quite clear, Mr. Blackwood. I'm tendering my resignation." After 23 years without notice? Without explanation? She almost smiled at that. Without explanation. As if the explanation wasn't sitting in David Chun's office, in the form of enough evidence to bring down his entire operation. "I'm afraid I can no longer be party to the Millfield project," she said simply. Harrison's eyes narrowed. For the first time in their professional relationship, he was really looking at her. Really seeing her. Party to it? "Margaret, you're a secretary. You file papers. You answer phones. You don't have opinions about company policy." There it was. The dismissal. The reduction of 23 years of observation and documentation to filing papers. The casual erasure of her humanity. Margaret straightened her shoulders. "Mr. Blackwood, I filed every paper related to the Millfield project. I've answered every phone call. I've scheduled every meeting. I've typed every memo. And I've watched you plan the destruction of 800 lives with the same casual indifference you'd show to ordering lunch." His face went pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know about the altered environmental impact studies. I know about the payments to state officials. I know about the buried safety reports. And I know that you've been lying to everyone, the government, the press, and most importantly, the people of Millfield Hollow." Harrison sank slowly into his leather chair, the fight draining out of him as the implications began to register. "What do you want?" For 23 years, Margaret had been asked what she wanted exactly once, on her first day, when HR asked if she preferred coffee or tea in the break room. Now, when it finally mattered, she knew exactly what to say. "I want you to cancel the Millfield project," Harrison laughed. Actually laughed. "Margaret, we have $200 million invested in that operation. State permits, federal approvals, congressional support. You think I'm going to walk away from all of that because my secretary has suddenly developed a conscience? I think you're going to walk away from it because the alternative is federal prison." The laughter died. "What are you talking about?" Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "David Chun, environmental attorney." She placed it carefully on Harrison's desk. "Mr. Chun will be filing suit against Blackwood Industries this afternoon. Environmental fraud, corruption of public officials, willful endangerment of protected waterways. The paperwork has already been submitted to the EPA, the FBI, and the Charleston Gazette." Harrison stared at the card as if it were a coiled snake. "You're bluffing." "I've never bluffed in my life, Mr. Blackwood. I don't have the luxury of playing games with people's lives." That's when he stood up, slowly, menacingly, the full force of his power and privilege focused on the woman who had served his coffee. "For 2 decades, do you have any idea what you've done? What you're up against? I own half the politicians in this state. I have lawyers who eat people like you for breakfast. I can destroy you, Margaret. I can make sure you never work again. I can. You can't do anything to me that you haven't already done to 800 other people." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Margaret had never raised her voice, never lost her composure. But something in her tone, a steel core that had been hidden for 23 years, made Harrison step back. "Those people in Millfield Hollow," she continued, "they trust the system. They believe that environmental protections mean something. They believe that their government won't sell them out to the highest bidder. They're wrong, of course, but they don't know it yet." She picked up the business card and placed it back in her purse. "I do know it. I've watched you buy and sell their future like it was a commodity. I've typed the memos that turned their children's health into acceptable losses. I've scheduled the meetings where you plan to poison their water and call it progress." Margaret walked to the door, then turned back one final time. "You want to destroy me? Go ahead. But understand this, I'm not fighting for myself anymore. I'm fighting for people who can't fight for themselves. And that makes me more dangerous than you can possibly imagine." The elevator ride down felt like falling through space. 23 floors, 23 years, 23 steps toward a future that Margaret couldn't predict, but no longer feared. In the lobby, she passed the bronze plaque that proclaimed Blackwood Industries' commitment to sustainable development and community partnership. The words that had made her sick for 3 years now seemed almost absurd. Lies carved in metal and mounted on marble. But lies had a way of becoming truth when enough people repeated them loudly enough. Outside, Charleston stretched under a canopy of autumn clouds. Somewhere in those hills, Millfield Hollow was waking up to what might be its last peaceful morning. Children were walking to school along roads that would soon be widened to accommodate mining trucks. Families were having breakfast at kitchen tables that would soon be condemned to make way for a processing plant. Margaret climbed into her 15-year-old Honda Civic, the same car she'd driven to work every day since 2008, and began the 2-hour drive home to Millfield Hollow, where she hadn't lived in 23 years, but where her heart had never left, where her parents were buried in a cemetery that was scheduled for relocation. Where 800 people were about to discover that their secretary, their invisible, forgettable secretary, had just declared war on the most powerful corporation in the state. The town hadn't changed much. Main Street still stretched between 2 rows of brick buildings that had stood since the 1920s. Murphy's General Store, Holloway's Diner, the First Baptist Church, with its white steeple and hand-painted sign advertising Sunday services. But Margaret could see the changes that mattered. Survey stakes driven into the ground along Miller's Creek, orange spray paint marking trees that were slated for removal. Trailer park at the edge of town where families displaced from the preliminary clearing had been relocated to temporary housing that everyone knew would become permanent. She parked in front of the diner and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Through the window, she could see familiar faces, people she'd grown up with, people who remembered her as Jimmy Rose's youngest daughter, the quiet one who'd moved to the city for work and rarely came back to visit. They had no idea that she'd been watching over them for 3 years, that she'd sacrificed her career, her security, her anonymity to give them a fighting chance, that the battle for their future was about to begin, and she was the only one who knew it was coming. Margaret took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into the diner. Conversation stopped. Not because they recognized her as a threat or a savior, but because in a town of 800 people, everyone notices a stranger, even when the stranger isn't really a stranger at all. "Margaret Rose, is that you?" The voice belonged to Betty Holloway, the diner's owner and the unofficial keeper of local news and gossip. She emerged from behind the counter, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron, her face breaking into a smile that erased 20 years in an instant. "Betty." Margaret returned the smile, feeling something loosen in her chest. "You look exactly the same." Flatterer. "What brings you back to our little corner of nowhere?" Before Margaret could answer, other voices joined in. Tom Murphy from the general store. Sarah Chun, David's aunt, she realized with a start. Elder James from the Baptist Church. People who remembered her baptism, her graduation, her parents' funeral. People who had no idea that she held their future in her hands. Margaret found herself surrounded by warmth and curiosity, fielding questions about her job in Charleston, her life in the city, whether she was married, whether she had children, when she might come back for good. Normal questions from normal people living normal lives that were about to be turned upside down. Actually, Margaret said, when the initial flurry of greetings had subsided, I'm here because of the mining project. Silence fell over the diner like a curtain. Tom Murphy's smile faded. You heard about that, did you? I heard about it. And I'm here to help stop it. Betty laughed, a sound with no humor in it. Stop it? Honey, that train left the station a long time ago. Blackwood's got permits, approvals, everything signed and sealed. Mayor Davidson says it's a done deal. Mayor Davidson is wrong. The words came out harder than Margaret intended. She softened her tone, but not her message. The permits were obtained through fraud. The environmental studies were falsified. The safety reports were buried. And there are federal laws that Blackwood Industries has been systematically violating for 3 years. Sarah Chun leaned forward. How do you know all this? Margaret looked around the diner at faces that had shaped her childhood, people who had been her parents' friends, her grandmother's church family, her community in the deepest sense of the word. Because I work for Blackwood Industries. Or I did, until this morning. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Elder James was the first to speak. What are you saying, child? Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a folder copies of documents she'd given to David Chun, evidence that represented 3 years of careful documentation. I'm saying that Harrison Blackwood has been lying to everyone. The state, the federal government, you, and I have proof. She spread the papers across the diner's largest table, watching as recognition dawned on face after face. Maps showing the real extent of the environmental damage. Memos discussing acceptable contamination levels for Miller's Creek. Financial projections that included line items for community displacement management. Betty picked up one of the documents, a report detailing the health risks associated with copper mining runoff. This says the water contamination could last for 50 years. At minimum, Margaret confirmed. And that's if everything goes according to plan. If there's an accident, if the containment systems fail, if the processing plant has problems, and all of those things are statistically likely, the contamination could be permanent. Tom Murphy's hands shook as he read through the relocation projections. They're planning to move the entire cemetery? Every grave, including recent ones, including. Margaret's voice caught slightly. Including my parents. Elder James looked up from the safety reports. These children's health risks, respiratory problems, developmental delays, cancer rates that could increase by 30% over the next generation. Margaret watched as the full weight of Blackwood's plans settled over the people she'd grown up with. These weren't statistics to them. These were their children, their grandchildren, their future. What can we do? Sarah asked. Margaret had been waiting for that question for 3 years. We fight. That's how the War Council began. In Holloway's diner, over coffee that grew cold, while 8 people who had never imagined themselves as revolutionaries planned to take on one of the most powerful corporations in the region. Margaret laid out the legal strategy. David Chun would file multiple lawsuits, environmental fraud, corruption of public officials, violations of the Clean Water Act. But lawsuits took time, and Blackwood had resources to delay and appeal for years. They needed public pressure, media attention, political support. They needed to make the cost of continuing the project higher than the cost of abandoning it. We'll need to organize, Elder James said. Get people informed. Get them angry. Angry enough to vote Davidson out of office, Tom added. He's up for re-election next year. Angry enough to call their representatives, Sarah said. My nephew David says federal pressure is what really scares corporations like Blackwood. Margaret listened to the plans forming around her, the natural leadership emerging from people who had never seen themselves as activists. These were farmers and shopkeepers and retirees, people who had spent their lives working hard and keeping their heads down and trusting the system to protect them. People who were about to discover that sometimes the system needed protecting from itself. There's something else, Margaret said when the initial planning had run its course. Something I need you to understand before we go any further. She looked around the table at faces that had grown serious, determined, but not yet afraid. Blackwood Industries will fight back, hard. They have money, lawyers, political connections. They'll try to discredit us. They'll try to divide us. They'll make promises to some and threats to others. And they'll come after anyone they see as a leader. She paused, letting that sink in. They'll come after me hardest of all. I've seen their playbook. I know how they operate. They'll try to destroy my reputation, my credibility, my life. And some of that will splash back on all of you. Betty reached across the table and covered Margaret's hand with her own. Child, your mama and daddy raised you to do right. That's what you're doing now. That's what we're all going to do. Elder James nodded. The good book says, if God be for us, who can be against us? I think the Lord has been preparing you for this fight your whole life. Margaret felt tears threatening. For the first time in hours. Not tears of fear or sadness, but tears of homecoming. She had spent 23 years in exile, serving the enemy, watching in silence as they planned the destruction of everything she loved. But exile was over. The battle was beginning. And for the first time since she'd walked out of Harrison Blackwood's office, Margaret Rose felt like she was exactly where she belonged. That night, Margaret drove out to the cemetery where her parents were buried. The headstones were simple granite markers, weathered by 20 years of mountain weather, but still clearly readable. James Franklin Rose, beloved husband and father. Mary Catherine Rose, beloved wife and mother. She knelt between the graves, placing fresh flowers on each one, daisies for her mother, who had loved simple beauty, and oak leaves for her father, who had loved the mountains. I kept quiet for so long, she whispered to them. I thought if I stayed invisible, if I didn't cause trouble, maybe things would work out on their own. Maybe someone else would fight the fight that needed fighting. A cool wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the old oak tree that had shaded these graves since before Margaret was born. But there wasn't anyone else. There was just me. And I finally figured out that sometimes staying quiet isn't protection, it's betrayal. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Tomorrow the real work would begin. Tomorrow she would help transform a town of 800 people into an army capable of taking on corporate greed and political corruption. Tomorrow, she would discover whether truth was still stronger than money in America. But tonight, she was just a daughter saying goodbye to parents who had taught her that some things were worth fighting for. Things like home, things like community, things like the belief that ordinary people could still stand up to extraordinary power and win. Margaret walked back to her car, leaving the cemetery quiet under a canopy of stars. Behind her, the mountains that had shaped her childhood rose like sleeping giants against the night sky. Mountains that Blackwood Industries wanted to tear apart for the copper hidden in their hearts. Mountains that Margaret Rose intended to protect. No matter what it cost her. The first shot fired in the war between Millfield Hollow and Blackwood Industries wasn't a lawsuit or a protest. It was a story. 3 days after Margaret's resignation, journalist Sarah Martinez from the Charleston Gazette published an expose that sent shockwaves through the state capitol. The headline ran across the front page in 72-point type: Blackwood's Buried Secrets. Environmental fraud alleged in Millfield mining project. Below it, a photograph of Margaret Rose standing in front of the cemetery where her parents were buried, holding a folder of documents that represented 3 years of careful documentation. The article laid out the case with devastating precision. Falsified environmental studies, buried safety reports, payments to state officials disguised as consulting fees. A pattern of deception that stretched from Harrison Blackwood's executive suite to the governor's mansion. By noon, Margaret's phone was ringing non-stop, other newspapers wanting interviews, environmental groups offering support, lawyers volunteering their services, politicians scrambling to distance themselves from a project that had suddenly become political poison, and Harrison Blackwood calling every hour with increasingly desperate assailants. Margaret didn't answer. She had said everything she needed to say to Harrison Blackwood. Now she had work to do. The town meeting was held at the Millfield Hollow Community Center, a cinder block building that doubled as a polling place and a venue for church suppers. It had been built to hold maybe 200 people comfortably. On the night Margaret Rose came home to speak publicly for the first time in 23 years, nearly 600 people crowded into every available space. They came from Millfield Hollow and the surrounding communities, farmers and shopkeepers and retirees, but also college students from Charleston and environmental activists from across the state. The story had spread beyond the local papers, beyond West Virginia, carried by social media and cable news into living rooms across the country. Margaret sat on the small stage beside David Chun and Elder James, looking out at an audience that included faces she'd known since childhood and faces she'd never seen before, united by a common enemy and a common cause. When Elder James introduced her, the applause was thunderous. Margaret stood slowly, walked to the microphone, and waited for silence. 23 years ago, she began, I left Millfield Hollow to work in Charleston. I told myself I was pursuing opportunity, building a career, making something of myself. Her voice carried clearly through the packed room, amplified not just by the sound system, but by the absolute attention of an audience hanging on every word. What I was really doing was running away. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I was running away from a place that seemed too small, too poor, too forgotten to matter in the modern world. I wanted to be part of something bigger, something important. Margaret looked out at the faces, young and old, hopeful and worried, angry and determined. It took me 23 years to realize that there is nothing bigger than home. Nothing more important than the people who shaped you. Nothing that matters more than protecting the place where your parents are buried and your children will grow up. The murmur became applause, but Margaret raised her hand for quiet. Harrison Blackwood thinks this is a fight between his corporation and a bunch of country people who don't understand business. He thinks money and political connections will be enough to brush us aside. Her voice hardened. He's wrong. The applause this time was sustained, defiant. Mr. Blackwood doesn't understand what he's up against. He sees 800 people in a forgotten town. What he doesn't see is 800 people who love their home enough to fight for it. 800 people who know the difference between progress and destruction. 800 people who understand that some things are not for sale. Margaret paused, letting the words settle. For 3 years, I watched him plan to destroy this place. I filed the papers. I answered the phones. I scheduled the meetings. And I documented everything. She held up a thick folder copies of the evidence that had already brought down 2 state officials and triggered a federal investigation. Everything they did. Every lie they told. Every law they broke. Every person they bribed. Every corner they cut. Every safety standard they ignored. The room was electric with anticipation. And now we're going to use that evidence to stop them. What followed was not just a speech but a battle cry. Margaret laid out the legal strategy. The multiple lawsuits already filed and the additional ones being prepared. the federal investigations that had been triggered, the political pressure that was building in Charleston and Washington. But more than that, she laid out a vision of what victory could look like. Millfield Hollow not just saved, but strengthened. Economic development that worked with the landscape instead of against it. Tourism based on the area's natural beauty instead of its destruction. Educational programs that brought young people back instead of driving them away. "We're not just fighting against something," Margaret said in closing. "We're fighting for something. For a future that honors our past. For development that serves our community instead of exploiting it. For the radical idea that ordinary people still have a voice in America." The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. When it finally died down, Margaret looked out at 600 faces united in purpose. Harrison Blackwood thinks he owns this place. He's about to learn that he's wrong. Some things belong to the people who love them, and we're going to prove it. Blackwood Industries' counterattack came swiftly and brutally. Within a week of the town meeting, Margaret found herself the target of a comprehensive character assassination campaign. Private investigators dug through her financial records, her employment history, her personal relationships. Opposition researchers examined every aspect of her life, looking for anything that could be used to discredit her. Testimony. They found nothing. Margaret Rose had lived a life of quiet integrity. She paid her taxes, kept her commitments, and had never been involved in anything more scandalous than a parking ticket. So they manufactured scandals, rumors, appeared on social media suggesting she was mentally unstable. Anonymous sources claimed she had been embezzling from Blackwood Industries for years. Fabricated documents appeared suggesting she was being paid by competing corporations to sabotage the Millfield project. None of it was true. All of it was effective. Doubt began to creep into some corners of the community. If Margaret had really worked for Blackwood Industries for 23 years, why should they trust her now? If she had evidence of wrongdoing, why hadn't she come forward sooner? If she was really fighting for the community, why was she being supported by outside environmental groups with their own agendas? The questions were subtle, insidious, designed to divide the community against itself. But Margaret had prepared for this. At a second town meeting, held just 2 weeks after the first, she addressed the rumors directly. "Harrison Blackwood is doing exactly what I said he would do," she told the crowd. "He's trying to destroy my credibility because he can't destroy my evidence. He's trying to divide us because he can't defeat us when we're united." She paused, looking out at faces that showed the strain of the past weeks. "Some of you are wondering if you can trust me. That's fair. You should ask hard questions. You should demand proof. You should be skeptical of anyone who asks you to risk your home and your future." Margaret reached into her briefcase and pulled out a bound document, 3 inches thick. "This is a complete record of every document I copied, every conversation I recorded, every meeting I attended in my 23 years at Blackwood Industries. It's been reviewed by federal investigators, verified by independent experts, and corroborated by other witnesses." She held the document above her head. "This isn't opinion. This isn't speculation. This is proof. Proof that Harrison Blackwood has been lying to you, to the state, to the federal government. Proof that he planned to poison your water, relocate your dead, and scatter your community to make room for an operation that would generate billions in profit and leave behind a wasteland." Margaret set the document on the podium. "But here's what Harrison Blackwood doesn't understand. This fight was never about me. It was never about whether you trust Margaret Rose the secretary or Margaret Rose the whistleblower. This fight is about whether you trust yourselves." She gestured toward the audience. "Every person in this room knows this place, knows these mountains, knows what clean water looks like and what poisoned water looks like, knows what healthy children look like and what sick children look like, knows the difference between a company that serves a community and a company that exploits it." Her voice rose with passion. You don't need me to tell you that Harrison Blackwood is lying. You just need to look at what he's proposing. Strip mining. That will remove entire mountaintops. Chemical processing that will contaminate Miller's Creek for generations. Heavy machinery running 24 hours a day through neighborhoods where children play. Margaret looked directly at individuals in the audience as she spoke. Mary Henderson, you've lived by Miller's Creek for 60 years. Do you need a government study to tell you what copper runoff will do to that water? Mary Henderson stood up. I've seen what mining does to water. My cousin lives in Kentucky. Their creek ran orange for 10 years after the mining company left. Tom Murphy, your family has been farming this land for 4 generations. Do you need an environmental impact statement to tell you what happens when topsoil gets contaminated? Tom. Murphy stood, land dies. Takes 50 years to come back, if it ever does. Sarah Chun, you teach our children. Do you need a health department report to tell you what respiratory problems look like? Sarah Chun rose from her seat. I've seen asthma rates triple in communities near mining operations. Children who can't run, can't play, can't breathe clean air. One by one, Margaret called on people throughout the audience. Farmers and teachers, and parents and grandparents. People whose knowledge came not from corporate reports, but from lived experience. People who understood the land because they worked it, the water because they drank it, the air because they breathed it. By the time she finished, 40 people were standing. 40 voices of expertise that no amount of corporate propaganda could. Silence. This is why Harrison Blackwood is afraid, Margaret said. Not because of what I know. Because of what you know. Because you can't be bought or intimidated or confused when you're fighting for your children's future. The applause was different this time. Not just supportive, but defiant. The sound of a community that had rediscovered its voice. The legal. Battles intensified through the fall and winter. David Chun's environmental lawsuit was joined by a federal criminal investigation into Blackwood Industries' permit applications. The EPA suspended the company's operating licenses pending review. 3 state officials resigned under pressure after their financial connections to Blackwood were exposed, but Harrison Blackwood didn't surrender. He hired the most expensive legal team money could buy. He launched a public relations campaign, portraying himself as a job creator being attacked by radical environmentalists. He threatened to relocate his operations to other states, taking thousands of jobs with him. Most dangerously, he began targeting individual community leaders. Tom Murphy's general store suddenly faced a tax audit. Sarah Chun received anonymous threats about her teaching license. Elder James found his church's tax-exempt status under review. And Margaret discovered that her small apartment in Charleston had been burglarized, nothing stolen, but her files ransacked, her computer accessed, her phone clearly bugged. The message was clear: abandon the fight or face escalating consequences. Instead, Margaret moved back to Millfield Hollow. She rented a small house on Sycamore Street, 3 blocks from where she'd grown up. Every morning, she walked to the cemetery to visit her parents' graves. Every afternoon, she worked with David Chen and the legal team, preparing for the trials that would determine the community's future. And every evening, she sat on her front porch, visible to anyone who wanted to see her, unbowed, unafraid. Home. The turning point came in February. During a packed hearing at the state capitol, Harrison Blackwood himself testified, flanked by lawyers and lobbyists, presenting Blackwood Industries as a responsible corporate citizen committed to environmental protection and community development. He was polished, confident, convincing. He spoke about jobs and economic growth, about environmental safeguards and community investment. He presented studies showing minimal environmental impact and maximum economic benefit. He portrayed the opposition as a small group of extremists manipulated by outside agitators. When he finished, there was polite applause from the corporate supporters in the audience. Then Margaret Rose stood to testify. She walked to the witness table carrying a single folder. No lawyers, no advisors. Just a secretary from Millfield Hollow with 23 years of evidence and a lifetime of conviction. "My name is Margaret Rose," she began. "For 23 years, I worked for Harrison Blackwood. I typed his memos. I filed his reports. I scheduled his meetings. I know exactly what he thinks about the people of Millfield Hollow." She opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is an internal memo from Mr. Blackwood to his senior staff, dated 18 months ago. I'm going to read it word for word." Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and began to read in the clear, steady voice that had served her through 2 decades of corporate meetings. "The Millfield population represents the path of least resistance for our expansion goals. Rural, aging, limited educational attainment, and minimal political connections. Standard community management protocols should be sufficient to minimize organized opposition. In the unlikely event of significant resistance, prepared counter-narratives will portray opposition as anti-development extremism funded by competing corporate interests." The silence in the hearing room was absolute. Margaret looked up from the memo, her eyes finding Harrison Blackwood across the room. "Community management protocols," she repeated. "That's what you call it when you lie to people about poisoning their water. Counter-narratives. That's what you call it when you try to destroy the reputation of anyone who tells the truth about your plans." She set the memo aside and pulled out another document. "This is a financial projection showing the cost-benefit analysis for the Millfield project. Under a section labeled Acceptable Losses, it lists projected increases in respiratory illness, cancer rates, and birth defects in the surrounding communities. The analysis concludes that the legal costs of future health-related lawsuits will be substantially lower than the profits from copper extraction." Margaret's voice remained steady, but her words cut through the room like a blade. "Acceptable losses. That's how Harrison Blackwood thinks about your children's health. As a cost of doing business, as an acceptable sacrifice for his profit margins." She pulled out document after document, each one more damning than the last. Communications with state officials discussing how to circumvent environmental regulations. Safety reports that had been altered to hide dangerous contamination levels. Financial records showing payments disguised as consulting fees. But the most devastating moment came when Margaret pulled out a recording device. "This is a conversation between Harrison Blackwood and his chief legal counsel, recorded during a meeting I attended to take minutes. I'm going to play 30 seconds of it." She pressed play. Harrison Blackwood's voice filled the hearing room. Clear and unmistakable. "These people don't understand the economics. They think their little town matters in the grand scheme of things. We'll give them some jobs, some community investment, make them feel important. Then we'll extract what we need and move on. By the time they realize what's happened, we'll be operating in 3 other states." His lawyer's voice responded. "What about long-term environmental consequences? Not our problem. We'll be done and gone before any of that becomes an issue." Margaret turned off the recording and looked directly at Harrison Blackwood, who had gone pale. "Not your problem," she repeated, "because you'll be done and gone. But we can't leave, Mr. Blackwood. This is our home. Our children will grow up here. Our grandchildren will inherit whatever you leave behind." She stood up, gathering her documents. "You said these people don't understand economics. You're wrong. We understand the economics perfectly. We understand that some things can't be measured in quarterly profit reports. We understand that a poisoned creek doesn't recover when the stock price goes up. We understand that dead mountains don't come back to life when the shareholders get their dividends." Margaret walked closer to the witness table, close enough to look Harrison Blackwood in the eye. "For 23 years I served you coffee every morning. I typed your letters. I answered your phones. I made your life easier while you planned to destroy mine. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every person in the packed hearing room heard every word. You thought I was invisible. You thought I didn't matter. You thought you could plan the destruction of 800 lives right in front of me, and I would just keep serving coffee and filing papers and staying quiet. Margaret smiled then, for the first time during her testimony. You thought wrong. The hearing room erupted in applause that went on for 5 minutes. When it finally died down, the committee chairman gavelled for order, but everyone in the room, legislators, lawyers, journalists, citizens, knew that something fundamental had just shifted. David had faced Goliath, and Goliath was bleeding. The decision came down 6 weeks later. The State Environmental Board voted unanimously to revoke all permits for the Millfield mining project. The EPA announced a comprehensive investigation into Blackwood Industries' operations nationwide. The FBI opened a criminal probe into corporate fraud and corruption of public officials. Harrison Blackwood resigned as CEO 3 days later. The announcement came in a terse press release that blamed unforeseen regulatory challenges and coordinated attacks by anti-development extremists. Margaret Rose was working in her garden when she heard the news. Betty Holloway called first, shouting so loud that Margaret had to hold the phone away from her ear. Then Sarah Chun, then Tom Murphy, then Elder James. Then dozens of other voices. A cascade of joy and relief and triumph that swept through Millfield Hollow like a spring flood. They had won. Against all odds. Against unlimited resources. Against the accumulated power of corporate wealth and political influence. 800 people in a forgotten town had stood up and said no. And the world had listened. That evening, the community gathered at the cemetery where Margaret's parents were buried, not for a funeral this time, but for a celebration. Elder James offered a prayer of thanksgiving. Sarah Chun read from a letter from the governor, officially apologizing for the state's role in the near disaster and promising new protections for rural communities. David Chin announced the establishment of the Margaret Rose Environmental Justice Foundation, funded by the settlement money from the lawsuit against Blackwood Industries. But Margaret herself said very little. She stood beside her parents' graves, surrounded by the people she had fought for, looking out over mountains that would remain unscathed and a creek that would run clear for her grandchildren's grandchildren. When the formal ceremonies ended and most of the crowd had dispersed, Margaret remained behind. She knelt between the 2 granite headstones, placing fresh flowers on each grave. I kept the promise, she whispered to them. I brought the fight home. I stood up. I spoke truth, and we won. A cool wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the scent of mountain laurel and the sound of Miller's Creek running clear and strong. In the distance, Margaret stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Tomorrow, she would start planning the next phase of community development. Tomorrow, she would work with environmental groups to ensure that other communities had the tools to fight similar battles. Tomorrow, she would help transform Millfield Hollow from a place that almost disappeared into a model for sustainable development. But tonight, she was just a daughter who had come home. A daughter who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to stay invisible. Sometimes, the most radical act is simply standing up and speaking truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, truth is stronger than money. Justice is more powerful than influence. And ordinary people can change the world. Margaret walked slowly back to her house on Sycamore Street, leaving the cemetery quiet under a canopy of stars. Behind her, the mountains that had shaped her childhood rose, like ancient guardians against the night sky. Mountains that would remain untouched, because a secretary had refused to stay silent. Mountains that would shelter future generations, because a daughter of Millfield Hollow had finally come home. 5 years later, Margaret Rose stood on the same platform where she had first addressed the community that had raised her, but the scene around her had transformed completely. Where survey stakes had once marked trees for destruction, hiking Trails now wound through protected forest. Where mining equipment had been scheduled to carve up Miller's Creek, a boardwalk now allowed visitors to observe wildlife undisturbed. Where temporary housing had sheltered displaced families, a sustainable development project provided affordable homes powered by solar energy and geothermal heating. Millfield Hollow had not just survived, it had thrived. The Margaret Rose Environmental Justice Center occupied a renovated building on Main Street, serving as headquarters for a network of rural communities across Appalachia. The center provided legal support, environmental monitoring, and community organizing resources to towns facing similar threats from extractive industries. More importantly, it had become a symbol, proof that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary power and win, proof that communities could develop economically without destroying themselves. Environmentally. Proof that democracy still worked when citizens refused to stay silent. Margaret looked out at the audience gathered for the center's 5th anniversary celebration. Many of the faces were familiar. Betty Holloway, now in her 70s, but still running the diner and serving as unofficial community historian. Tom Murphy, whose general store had expanded into an ecotourism outfitter. Sarah Chun, who had become the town's first female mayor and was implementing innovative environmental education programs. Elder James, now retired from active ministry, but still serving as the community's moral compass and keeper of collective memory. But there were new faces too. Young families who had moved to Millfield Hollow, specifically because of its reputation as a place where environmental protection and economic development worked hand in hand. College students conducting research on sustainable community development. Journalists documenting what had become known as the Millfield model. And scattered throughout the audience, representatives from dozens of other communities that had used the lessons of Millfield Hollow to fight their own battles against corporate exploitation. Communities that had won. David Chun, now a partner in a prestigious environmental law firm, served as master of ceremonies. He had grown from an idealistic young lawyer into one of the most effective environmental advocates in the region, but he always credited Margaret Rose with teaching him that the law was only as powerful as the people willing to stand behind it. 5 years ago, David told the audience, a secretary from this community walked into my office with a box of documents and a simple request: help us save our home. What I didn't realize then was that she wasn't just asking for legal representation. She was starting a revolution. Applause filled the community center, the same building where Margaret had first spoken publicly about Blackwood Industries' deception. The revolution wasn't violent. It wasn't radical in the traditional sense. It was simply the revolutionary idea that ordinary people deserve to have a voice in decisions that affect their lives. That communities should benefit from their own resources instead of being exploited by outside interests. That environmental protection and economic development don't have to be enemies. David paused, his eyes finding Margaret in the front row. But mostly, it was the revolutionary idea that someone who serves coffee and files papers and stays quiet for 23 years might actually be the most dangerous person in the room if she finally decides to speak. The applause this time was sustained, emotional. Margaret stood slowly, acknowledging the recognition, but deflecting it with the modest grace that had characterized her throughout the fight. When she reached the podium, the room fell silent. Margaret had become a practiced public speaker in the 5 years since her first testimony, but she had never lost the directness and authenticity that had made her such a powerful witness against corporate power. When I walked out of Harrison Blackwood's office 5 years ago, she began, I thought I was ending my career. What I was actually doing was beginning my real life's work. She looked out at faces that represented not just Millfield Hollow, but communities across the region and the nation. I spent 23 years watching powerful people make decisions that would affect the lives of ordinary people. I saw how those decisions were made in boardrooms where the affected communities had no voice, by people who would never live with the consequences of their choices. Margaret's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen behind the curtain of corporate power and political influence. I learned that the most important decisions affecting our communities are often made by people who have never walked our streets, never drunk our water, never breathed our air. People who see us as statistics in a cost-benefit analysis rather than human beings with children and dreams and the right to determine our own futures. She paused, letting that sink in. But I also learned something else. I learned that those powerful people are not as powerful as they think. I learned that their authority depends on our silence. I learned that when ordinary people refuse to stay quiet, extraordinary things can happen. Margaret gestured toward the audience. Look around. This room. 5 years ago, most of you had never been to a town meeting, never called a legislator, never thought of yourselves as activists. You were teachers and farmers and shopkeepers and retirees. You were people who worked hard, raised your families, and trusted the system to protect you. Her voice grew stronger. And then you discovered that trust was misplaced. You discovered that the system was designed to benefit those who already had power, not those who needed protection. You discovered that if you wanted justice, you would have to fight for it yourselves. The room was electric with recognition. So you fought. You learned how to read environmental impact statements. You learned how to organize community meetings. You learned how to call reporters and lobby legislators and file lawsuits. You learned that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's something you have to actively participate in if you want it to work. Margaret's eyes found individual faces in the audience as she spoke, people whose lives had been transformed by their decision to stand up and fight back. Mary Henderson, you went from being a quiet grandmother to being the most effective water quality monitor in the region. Tom Murphy, you went from selling hunting licenses to leading sustainable tourism initiatives. Sarah Chun, you went from teaching children to governing a community. She smiled, expression of genuine pride and affection. You didn't change because someone told you to. You changed because circumstances demanded it. Because when your home is threatened, when your children's future is at stake, when everything you love is under attack, you discover reserves of strength and courage you never knew you had. The applause started spontaneously, building to a crescendo that lasted several minutes. When it finally died down, Margaret's expression grew more serious. But we can't stop here. We can't be satisfied with saving just our own community. Because for every Millfield Hollow that successfully fights back, there are 10 other communities that don't have the resources or the knowledge or the support they need to protect themselves. She pulled out a folder thinner than the one she had carried into that first town meeting, but no less significant. This contains reports from 37 communities across Appalachia that are currently facing threats similar to what we faced 5 years ago: strip mining, fracking, chemical processing, pipeline construction, corporate operations that promise economic development but deliver environmental destruction. Margaret held up the folder. These communities need what we learned. They need legal support. They need organizing assistance. They need proof that it's possible to stand up to corporate power and win. Her voice rose with passion. They need to know that a secretary who kept quiet for 23 years can become a voice that changes everything. They need to know that 800 people in a forgotten town can defeat one of the most powerful corporations in the state. They need to know that ordinary people fighting for their homes are the most extraordinary force in American democracy. Margaret set the folder on the podium. So our work isn't finished, it's expanding. The Margaret Rose Environmental Justice Center isn't just about Millfield Hollow anymore. It's about every community that refuses to be sacrificed for someone else's profit. It's about every person who discovers that staying silent is not protection, it's surrender. She looked directly into the television cameras that were broadcasting the event statewide. If you're watching this from a community that's under threat, Know this, you are not powerless. You are not voiceless. You are not alone. The same laws that protected us can protect you. The same strategies that worked for us can work for you. The same courage that saved our home can save yours. Margaret paused, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly through the silent room. All you have to do is refuse to stay invisible. The standing ovation lasted for 10 minutes. When it finally ended, Margaret stepped away from the podium and back into the crowd, not as a celebrity or a symbol, but as a member of a community that had learned to protect itself. Later that evening, after the formal ceremonies had ended and most of the visitors had departed, Margaret found herself back at the cemetery where her parents were buried. But she wasn't alone. Sarah Chun was there, along with her husband and 2 young children. Tom Murphy had brought his wife and teenage son. Betty Holloway sat on a folding chair beside Elder James, who was reading from a worn Bible by the light of a battery-powered lantern. They had come not for a formal memorial, but for something more personal. A quiet moment to remember where the fight had started and what it had cost and what it had achieved. Margaret knelt between her parents' graves, placing fresh flowers on each headstone, the same ritual she had performed every week for 5 years. "We did it," she whispered to them. "We saved the home you gave me. We protected the community that raised me. We proved that love is stronger than money and truth is more powerful than lies." She stood slowly, looking around at the faces illuminated by lantern light. "But mostly, we proved that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things when they have something worth fighting for." Elder James closed his Bible and offered a prayer of thanksgiving, not just for the victory they had achieved, but for the community they had become in the process of fighting for it. As the small group prepared to leave, Sarah Chun's daughter, a precocious 8-year-old named Grace, tugged at Margaret's sleeve. "Miss Margaret, my mom says you used to be invisible. How can someone be invisible?" Margaret knelt down to the child's level, smiling at the question that went to the heart of everything she had learned. "I thought I was invisible because I didn't speak up when I saw something wrong. I thought if I stayed quiet and didn't cause trouble, I would be safe. But I learned that silence isn't safety, it's just another kind of prison." Grace nodded solemnly, processing this adult wisdom with the seriousness that children bring to important matters. "So how did you become visible?" Margaret looked around at the cemetery, at the mountains rising beyond it, at the community that had rallied to protect both. "I told the truth. I stood up for what was right. I spoke for people who couldn't speak for themselves. And I discovered that when you fight for something bigger than yourself, you become bigger than you ever imagined you could be." Grace smiled and ran back to her parents, satisfied with the answer. Margaret watched the family walk away, hand in hand, toward a future that would be cleaner and safer, because a secretary had refused to stay silent. As Margaret made her own way home through the quiet streets of Millfield Hollow, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Harrison Blackwood's executive suite to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been invisible, a woman who poured coffee and filed papers, and disappeared into the background of other people's important lives. Tonight, she was a voice that had changed the world, not because she had sought fame or power, but because she had finally understood that some things are worth any sacrifice. Things like home, things like community, things like the radical idea that ordinary people deserve to have a voice in the decisions that shape their lives. Margaret reached her small house on Sycamore Street, the same street where she had grown up, 3 blocks from where her parents had raised her to believe in justice and truth, and the power of standing up for what's right. She sat on her front porch for a moment, looking out at a town that had been saved not by politicians or lawyers or outside experts, but by citizens who had refused to surrender their future to corporate greed. Town that had learned to protect itself. A community that had discovered its own power. A place where democracy still worked because people still believed it was worth fighting for. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message, another community in Kentucky asking for help with a fracking operation that threatened their water supply. She smiled and typed back a simple response, "We'll be there." Because the fight never really ends. There's always another Millfield Hollow under threat. Always another corporation that thinks ordinary people can be bought or intimidated or ignored. Always another secretary who needs to discover that serving coffee doesn't have to mean staying silent. Always another community that needs to learn it has the power to save itself. Margaret Rose stood up, stretched, and walked inside to begin planning her next battle, because she had learned the most important lesson of all. Invisible people are only invisible until they decide to be seen. And once they step into the light, they can illuminate the whole world. Margaret Rose wasn't supposed to win. A secretary with no money, no connections, no power, facing off against corporate empire and political corruption. The smart money was on Harrison Blackwood. The safe bet was surrender. But Margaret knew something the smart money didn't. That ordinary people fighting for their homes are the most dangerous force in America. That love of place is stronger than love of profit. That when truth finally finds its voice, it can shatter any lie. For 23 years, she served coffee and stayed silent. Until the day she realized that silence wasn't protection, it was surrender. Until the day she understood that the most powerful thing she could do was refuse to be invisible anymore. Until the day she stood up and spoke truth to power. And changed everything. This is why we tell these stories, because in a world that worships money and power, we need reminders that neither is stronger than a community that refuses to give up, that neither can defeat people who love their home enough to fight for it, that neither can silence voices that speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. At Still Standing Souls, we believe in the Margaret Roses of the world, the ones who seem powerless until the moment they discover their strength, the ones who stay quiet until staying quiet becomes betrayal, the ones who serve others until serving truth becomes their calling. Secretaries and teachers and farmers and retirees who look at injustice and say, "Not on my watch." Who look at corporate greed and say, "Not in my community." Who look at political corruption and say, "Not with my silence." Because the most beautiful souls aren't those that never face darkness. They're the ones that walk through it and somehow keep their light burning. The ones that refuse to stay invisible. The ones that remain standing. Join us at Still Standing Souls, where every story matters, every voice counts, and every person who refuses to surrender finds a home. Subscribe now. Because somewhere out there, another Margaret Rose is deciding whether to stay silent or speak truth. And your support might be what tips the balance toward courage. Still Standing Souls. Your voice matters more than you know.